All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to encourage everyone who is tuning in to use the chat box if you need to send us a message, and I see a message right now. I'm going to pull that up just so I can see it. And make sure that you can hear us and see everything that's going on. I see that the Facebook version is working. If you do have a problem technically with the sound or with viewing on your computer, you can send us a note to the chat box as well. And I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation, From Herd to Households, Unpacking the Challenges and Benefits Around Animal Source Food. And this webinar is being presented by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And I'm going to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about us and Feed the Future as well. So Feed the Future is the U.S. government's global hunger and food security initiative, and you can look at this website to learn more. There are 12 target countries and many, many partners, and a large number of those partners are called innovation labs. There's more than 20 of them, and these are partnerships between universities and developing country research institutions that jointly tackle some of the world's greatest challenges in agriculture and food security in developing countries. And now I'm located here at the University of Florida. We host one of the innovation labs, the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And I encourage you after this webinar to visit our website and learn more about us and our work. And I'm going to read to you our vision, which says, our vision is to sustainably intensify smallholder livestock systems in order to improve the nutrition, health, livelihoods, and incomes of the poor. So that's just a quick introduction to us. And I hope, as I said, that you'll take some time to learn more about us after this webinar. But right now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Lad.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm really excited about this topic. I want to start by just introducing our two speakers, and then after they're done, we'll have a period for questions and answers at that point. So first I'm going to go in order of where they'll be speaking and the slides that they'll be discussing. So I'm going to start with Dr. Sarah McCune. She's assistant professor at the Department of Environmental and Global Health and the Center for African Studies. She's the lead for the Human and Health and Nutrition for the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for the Livestock Systems at the University of Florida. She's worked with global health programs for the past 15 years, predominantly in the West African Sahel, but she's also been in Nepal, Haiti, Uganda, and Ethiopia. She has a BA, a master's in public health, and a PhD in interdisciplinary area in ecology. Her research seeks to kind of explain the complex household dynamics that affect child growth, nutritional outcomes, and including behavior change, women's empowerment and gender dynamics, climate change, hygiene and sanitation, and livestock ownership, which is a mouthful that she's trying to attain under all of that. So it's exciting to see. Then we also have Dr. Jeff Dahl is also joining us, and he is the Harriet B. Weeks Professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida. He also has served as the chair for over 12 years. Dr. Dahl conducts applied and basic research with direct impact on dairy production. Specific research interests include effects of photoperiod manipulation on production and health, the impact of frequent milking in early lactation on milk production, and heat stress abatement during the dry period on cow productivity and health. His work spans the U.S. and abroad, including Sri Lanka, Nepal, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. He's sought after as a speaker on many topics in a lot of countries. He's also a member of several professional organizations and societies, and currently serves as the president for the American Dairy Science Association. So first if we can go to the next slide, I think we have a little bit of an agenda that we want to go over real quick. I'm not sure who's advancing slides. There we go. So we're just the slides you're going to go through, they're going to be between Dr. McCune and Dr. Dahl. They're going to give a little bit about the context, talk a little bit about animal source and nutrient security, food security and animal source foods, food security and social norms, challenges to livestock for food and nutrition security, food versus feed, animal source foods and the environment, economic impacts of animal source foods, and then we'll talk a little bit about the summary and policy implications that has. So I hope you guys are ready. I think this will be a really exciting session, and I'm going to take it over to Dr. McCune.
Great, thank you, Lad. So I wanted to start with just an overview of why we're having the conversation. So all of these innovation labs are part of the Feed the Future initiative from USAID, and we have a charge to really affect through nutrition the health and incomes and well-being of populations globally. And so what we're looking at here is stunting, and stunting is an indicator of chronic malnutrition. And while it's not the only or necessarily the best indicator, depending upon what you're looking for, it's an important indicator because it's something that measures the cumulative effect of either sequential periods of drought or crisis or whatnot, or it may reflect just a chronic situation that has no acute period. But so when we look at something like stunting, we want to understand the proportion of the population. Often we're looking at under 5s, but we often look at adults as well in a population level and what the impacts are. And so you can see in this that there are impacts. Child mortality is 4 times more, a child is 4 times more likely to die if he or she is stunted than non-stunted. There are impacts on IQ scores, so a reduction by as much as 11 points in IQ score among stunted children. When you look at incomes, and the incomes who are stunted earn up to 22% less than those who are non-stunted. And then all of that accumulates into economic impact on countries. And so in some analyses you see in countries like Ethiopia as much as a 16% loss in GDP because of the stunting that occurs. And of course, stunting is just a metric for child growth. It's a Z-score that's determined by the child's height for their age. But that becomes an indicator of what else is happening in that person's cognitive development along the way. So this is just to sort of set the stage and say, why are all these initiatives focusing in on nutrition? And that is to say that it matters. It matters broadly, whether you're looking at economic outcomes. I don't have control over this anymore. Okay. Thank you. As well as other indicators for well-being, more specific to human well-being and health. So as we start to talk about nutrition and think about why it matters to populations globally, especially within the context of livestock, one of the first things that we begin to think about is food security. So first, let's define food security. When we talk about food security, most often we use the definition set out by the UN, which is the condition to which all people at all times have physical, social, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And people spend a lifetime working to unpack this definition and really understand in any given community, how do you hit all of the dimensions of food security? And it's evolved over the years to be culturally situated and whatnot. But what I really want to focus in on today is that having nutritious food is part of this. So it's not sufficient. You can't reach food security simply by having enough calories. Part of it is the nutrition security that comes, and that's the diversity in the diet, meeting all of the body's requirements from various nutrients. So as we think about food security, we're going to hone in on the individual level, but at a broader population level, it's being threatened by all sorts of dynamic systems. Largely and importantly today, we can't talk about threats to food security without thinking about climate change. Not simply because it's affecting the planet, but when you look at the areas that are most vulnerable to climate change and least able to adapt, you're talking about places that are already food insecure. So an area that I know well across the Sahel of West Africa, food insecurity is already quite high, but climate change is having dramatic impacts there. Interestingly, building on that, so too is that area experiencing very high rates of population growth. So population growth produces added demand for, it's an added threat to food security. Interestingly, over the past 15 to 30 years, we've made great strides in child survival. So we've really been able to reduce under 5 mortality in many of the same places that food security remains a problem. Ironically, by having children survive into childhood and on into adulthood, you're generating more and more mouths to feed. So there is an increased demand for food by having increased survival of children. Food production and food prices are major threats to food security because of how interconnected the global food system is today. We have loss of certain food varieties, particularly in areas that have been traditionally more isolated, where there was a heavy reliance on indigenous foods. As people become more reliant on markets, and as those markets become more global markets, you have a reduction in variety of foods. And then land and water scarcity. Both are issues that drive food insecurity for many people, particularly in the low and middle income countries. And as we begin to hone in the conversation to an individual level and thinking about how people are either food secure and nutrition secure or not, we have to begin to think about who's vulnerable to food insecurity. And we do a fairly good job in development and in research thinking about, for example, in nutrition, women and children are highly vulnerable populations for a litany of reasons. But one of the things that we're not necessarily very good at is unpacking what does it mean to be a woman, or what does it mean to be a child? Because it's not a universal experience even within a country or a region. So if we talk about what is it to be a woman, well, what is it to be a woman in Nepal versus Ethiopia? Well, what is it to be a woman in Nepal who's in Western Nepal, who's of a certain ethnicity or a certain caste, and of what age? So we can't really begin to conceptualize food security without thinking about exactly who it is we're talking about. And while we do a fairly good job of thinking generally about vulnerable groups, thinking about how these vulnerabilities intersect to really become quite deterministic in terms of people's food security or insecurity is something that remains a challenge for a lot of research and development projects. So what you see here is a modification of the very widely recognized UNICEF model for malnutrition. This is as adapted and modified by Black et al. In 2008. But what I want to highlight here is not just the traditional understanding that we have basic causes of malnutrition, which are at the bottom in gray, having to do with capital and socioeconomic status and political context, nor even the underlying causes of poverty and self-employment and all of remittances, things that make livelihoods more or less robust. But I really want to highlight what I call the intermediate causes of malnutrition, and those are food security, care, and the environment, which is typically defined as the household environment as well as health services. When we look at these three determinants of nutrition, you'll see that household food insecurity is one of them. So if we're looking at malnutrition, we frame it in the negative as insecurity. But what you see is there is still a lot that's driving undernutrition that's unrelated to food insecurity. So in inadequate care, unhealthy living environment, or inadequate access to healthcare services is sufficient to render a child malnourished, even if he or she is food insecure. And that's where nutrition security becomes really the goal, is to say it's not just having access to and that complex definition of the right and sufficient foods, but nutritious foods. So food security is a necessary but non-sufficient requirement for nutrition of the child at the end. And ultimately, disease and dietary intake become, and the interaction between the two become the major drivers of nutrition. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is the relationship fundamentally between these two elements, food security and nutrition as an outcome. In this context, we're really talking about livestock. And so as we begin in the global south and low and middle income countries, in many smallholder farming communities, livestock are part of a mixed livelihood package that people practice. And so there are very direct ways that livestock contribute to food security. Some of these, very perhaps self-evident for many of you, include growth in agricultural yields, greater reduction in nutritional stunting than other economic growth. So you've got, as opposed to other agricultural investments, you've got more bang for your buck in the livestock space. There's significantly food and nutrition insecure households are those households who rely on agriculture, including livestock, for their livelihood. So when we look globally, where we have food insecure, there is a relationship. Those families do often have access to livestock. So we begin to question, what is the ability to leverage this as an asset? And then most specifically to the work that we do here and that I'm working on specifically, we know that livestock holders are more likely than their non-livestock holding counterparts to consume animal source foods. And that is both a function of proximity as well as economics. So if you go into mixed farming livestock keeping households and you have households without livestock, those tend to be the poorest households. So when people have the ability to invest in livestock and through livestock, they do. And therefore, there's a correlation with income there. And so what you see is that livestock and human nutrition outcomes are derived through three pathways. We've got food production, so direct auto-consumption of food can happen that way. Food production leads to agricultural income, so income generated by livestock production can be used for purchasing a diversity of foods that might or might not be ASF. Interestingly, a lot of the households we work with, people may produce ASF and sell it and purchase different forms of ASF, animal source food. So there are lots of different ways that income can generate improved nutritional outcomes. And really importantly is women's empowerment. So livestock as a space within agriculture within which women can be empowered, it's an area where decision making can be fostered, and areas for improvement in women's empowerment can lead to human nutrition. So in some of the very seminal work in this realm where women have not simply ownership but co-ownership, the difference between co-ownership or not owning livestock is associated with significant differences in child nutrition outcomes in that household. So women's empowerment is a third and important pathway that connects livestock to human nutrition. And all of those things intersect in what I've done here is sort of a remodel of the UNICEF. You'll recognize those immediate and proximate determinants of health on the right of nutrition. But what I've done is tried to demonstrate how the livestock system feeds into these three pathways of food production, income generation, and women's empowerment to then affect the determinants of what become nutrition, so framed here in the positive space. But it's not simply dietary intake. They affect a family's ability to access health services and whatnot, both through women's empowerment, but also income. So some of the seminal literature that feed into this have to do with, so livestock improving nutrition through income. So there's more income to purchase enough food of nutritional quality. This might be sweet potatoes or yams or just a simple diversity of food. We know how important fruits and vegetables are in the diet. And increased incomes allow people to do that. So it might be through the sale of livestock that people are able to diversify their diets. We know that there's increased resilience, that households in the face of climate change that are able to diversify their livelihood streams, income streams, are better able to face and rebound from exogenous external shocks. So they're more resilient. Back to the women's empowerment, when women have control over assets and income, we know that there are associations with improvements in child health outcomes. And as well, the ability for children within the household to consume animal source foods is fostered by access to livestock and the ability to improve nutrition. So both of those latter points, you'll notice a reference, a piece of my own work, which is the 2019 McCune reference there. And I wanted to share a little bit of results from a study that's not published yet, but that we're in the process of publishing right now, coming out of a study. It was a one-year behavior change study in Burkina Faso. We reference it as the ENOUGH study, which means one egg in French, or it just sounds like enough. Is it enough? But what we found was that through this innovative behavior change strategy, we not only were able to increase egg consumption, which is indicated at the top right. You'll see that in the full intervention group, which received the benefit of the gifting of chickens to children. So they had an asset gift as part of behavior change strategy. 4 chickens went to each household. But they also received integrated nutrition and agriculture training. The partial group received just that INA training with no assets, and the control group received nothing. And what we're able to demonstrate is that we could significantly increase egg consumption, both in the partial and full intervention group over the control, simply with the behavior change, even without the asset. And when you look at the numbers of eggs consumed in the past week, In the full intervention group, so what you see here is just at least 1 egg in the past week. But when you unpack that by number, the full intervention group ate over 6 eggs in the past week, the partial just over 2, and the control just over 1. We did get some social bleed at the end, so the control group began rising at the end. But so real significant differences in eggs consumed. Importantly, back to the left-hand side, women were making a lot more of the decision. So this is just the metrics on how many women reported themselves as the decision maker for that. And underneath that, and importantly, able to demonstrate a shift in wasting. So a significant, at p-value of 0.051, marginal statistical significance between the full and the control group in a reduction of wasting among kids. And these were kids that were targeted at 6 to 12 months. The sample ended up being an average age of 9 months, but a range between 6 and 15 months because of a couple of outliers. But it contributes to this body of literature showing that animal source food has a real potential to change growth outcomes and nutritional outcomes in kids.
Thank you, Sarah. So I think Sarah has done a really good job of setting the stage in terms of the importance of providing animal source foods from a food and nutrient security standpoint and the importance for women's empowerment. But I want to just address a couple of the at least perceived limitations of promotion of animal source food production and also consumption. And the first one is one of the most basic. It's the idea that there's a significant competition between crops that are used for animal food and crops that could then be just put in directly to the human consumable stream of food. And this is actually not the case. When we look at this figure here, I think it illustrates quite well the significant proportion of animal consumed feed is really made up of components that are not appropriate from a human consumption standpoint. The majority, well over 80%, approaching essentially 85% of the feed that animals use to produce human consumable outputs are not going to be edible by the human in the human diet. And so really a very small percentage of what is grown could potentially be directly fed to the human population, but the return on that small investment of human consumable crops to animals really yields a significant output of high nutrient density human consumable products in the form of animal source foods. And that leads into the idea that there is competition for land use between human consumable crops and animal crops. And in fact, much of the Earth's surface is wholly inappropriate for the production of crops that would go directly into the human food chain. Much of the area that we have is appropriate only for grazing, particularly of ruminant animals and other hindgut fermenters that can be used for human consumable outputs. In addition, particularly our ruminant species, so cattle, goats, sheep, they are going to be converting a significant amount of agro-industrial co-products and byproducts. So things like cottonseed, things like soybean meal, other things that do not go into the human consumable food chain, those animals can actually use those again to produce highly nutrient-dense outputs that can be consumed by humans. So we're really doing a significant conversion, not only of the grazing lands and the forages that are produced in those lands, but also with many of these co and byproducts that we simply can't eat. In addition, the rangelands and grazing areas that our animals are on actually provide essential ecosystem services that typically aren't compensated for, but have a huge impact on things like water recharge, wildlife habitat, and other ecosystem services for the animal use provides to the human population. So turning now to the other idea that there may be limitation or challenge in terms of livestock production affecting greenhouse gas outputs and having an impact on climate change. This is another one that we really have to look at in the appropriate context. This is a report where the authors modeled the impacts of completely removing all animal source foods from the diet in the U.S. and the impact that that would have on greenhouse gas production in total. And obviously, by removing animal source foods completely from the U.S. diet, there was a reduction in total greenhouse gas output, but the emissions were not really lowered that much. It was really only about 2.6 percentage points of the total in terms of the reduction in CO2 outputs, because obviously other areas of agriculture are going to have greenhouse gas outputs associated with their productivity, and those increased in order to provide a greater amount of total calories and total food output in this model system. But really the most important aspect of this analysis was the dietary changes that occurred, and this gets back to nutrient insecurity. So when animal source foods were completely eliminated from the U.S. diet, there were very rapid challenges with regard to some of the essential vitamins and also some of the other nutritional components that we see only from animal source foods as opposed to other foods that humans consume. So yes, there could be a slight decrease in greenhouse gas outputs by eliminating livestock from the entire diet of humans in the U.S., but not to the extent that we would expect in terms of a significant impact on total greenhouse gas output. And more importantly, we'd be balancing that against a significant reduction in nutrient security of the population. So when we think about the efficiency of animal production, I think that this is really an area where we need to focus our efforts in order to improve the total output of animal source foods and human consumable foods per unit of greenhouse gas output. And if we take this as an example, when we look at productivity in the U.S. of a single cow versus what it would take, for example, in India to produce the same amount of milk, I think it becomes very apparent that we need to start thinking about the total output per unit and improving production efficiency in order to realize decreases in total greenhouse gas output and certainly decreases on a per unit of human consumable food output in general. So improving technically production capacity of animals throughout the world is probably going to have more of a positive impact long term on our total impact on climate change. So we've really got a couple of pressing obligations that we have to meet, and they seem to be in opposition, but we need to feed a growing population in the world, but we also have to look after the environment. And so when we think about how to move forward with this and make changes, I think it's appropriate that we use indices of sustainability that reflect both of these goals. And from an animal productivity standpoint, what we want to look at is greenhouse gas emissions per unit of human consumable food produced. And by that we mean emissions intensity. So this is a fairly straightforward analysis. It's going to look at the total greenhouse gas produced per unit of livestock product, that is the human consumable output from that animal, be it in the form of, for example, milk from dairy animals or meat from meat-producing animals. We really need to put it on that same equivalency in order to move forward in improving human nutrition. So when we look at increasing total global output of animal source foods, increasing the efficiency of those folks' production around the world will probably go much further towards meeting that global demand while decreasing the environmental impact than by simply eliminating overall consumption and production of animal source foods. In addition, as Sarah touched on earlier, there are significant co-contributions that livestock make to the economic and overall livelihood of folks around the world. Livestock contributes about 750 million livelihood folks around the world depend on that, and about 1.5 billion jobs depend on livestock production. In many developing countries, 2/5 of the gross domestic product is going to depend on livestock productivity, so significant impact, particularly in some of those lower income and emerging economies around the world. 25% of the protein and 18% of the total calories consumed globally in 2016 were in the form of livestock or animal source foods. And in addition to their food contributions, livestock are used for traction by about 50% of the world's farmers. So in addition to having an impact on animal source food output, they also have an impact on total agricultural output in about half of the world's farms.
So we just want to wrap up in summary before we take questions by saying that clearly, based on the discussion, livestock production is at the heart of educational, nutritional, economic, and sustainability needs of the world. And a key to nutritional security is a key to nutritional security in both developing and developed countries is livestock and their production of ASF.
And we know that livestock will contribute to global greenhouse gas production, but there are significant opportunities for improvement in total output of greenhouse gases and certainly in output of greenhouse gases per unit of human consumable food that's produced. I think the way to go about looking at this is via emissions intensity. That's really the endpoint that would be appropriate to use as a benchmark, so that we can continue to improve animal source food yield while reducing emissions. And if we're going to increase livestock production, we want to do it sustainably, especially in developing and emerging economies, because we want to be able to ensure that we have both food and nutritional security while meeting these environmental milestones for sustainability.
Great, thank you guys very much. That was very interesting, very complex issue from, vulnerability of cultures and individual cultures even within countries, and how specific we get to the changing climate, both politically and environmentally, and how both of these things affect that. I think it's an area where you're looking at with livestock and then animal, consumption of animal source foods. You're looking at those convergences and tensions between developed world is probably consuming too much, but then we've got a lot of areas, and especially certain people groups, especially children under 2 or that first 1,000 days, that maybe are not consuming enough animal source protein, and kind of the importance of that. To be honest, being a nutritionist, nothing that Dr. McCune said was very shocking, but I was a little bit surprised by a couple of the statements that Dr. Dahl made around greenhouse gases specifically. Anything that you hear about this, and when people are talking about, oh, we should not be eating animal source and we've got to sustain the earth, and then to hear it's only about 3%, a little under 3% if you got rid of that. I think that's kind of fascinating that a lot of people don't know. I do have a really quick question for Dr. Dahl, and then I think I'm going to have Tim open up to some of those that have asked questions. But do you know, and I may be putting you on the spot here, but do you know the number of greenhouse gases that is contributed to agriculture as a whole, including livestock, versus other things like industrialization of, pollution and other type things?
Yeah, it's a good question. It hasn't really been looked at. There's the first report that came out, Livestock's Long Shadow, was really comparing output from livestock production and agriculture to other forms or other industries that put out greenhouse gases. In that case, it was compared to the transportation industry. It was supposedly just as bad. But in fact, they kind of compared apples and oranges. So they didn't do a full life cycle assessment for the other industries like they did for livestock. And the most appropriate one has been done in the U.S., where it looks like total agriculture is about 5 to 6%, I think, for the greenhouse gas output as proportion, and transportation was somewhere in the 15% to 17% range. So there are folks working on a more appropriate apples to apples comparison on a global basis, but that's the best one that's out there right now, done by the U.S. EPA, but only for the U.S.
Okay. Well, that is interesting when you start looking at it in that way, because I think we often just focus on that, the animals, we've got to stop eating all these animals and that'll solve all our problems. And that obviously is not the case. Jim, I'm going to hand this over to you. I think there's at least a few questions coming in online.
Yes, I can read the chat questions if you'd like me to.
That'd be great.
Okay, so this is from Emily, asking, could you provide examples of some areas where the land used for animal grazing would not be suitable for growing human food instead? In the U.S., for instance, cattle farms are located right next to cropland intended for human consumption, essentially the same land. I'm curious what percentage of land used for livestock is unsuitable for human food versus land used for livestock that is suitable?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that I have that number right off the top of my head, but I know that just in terms of total suitability, much of the land that is grazed now has been used or has been viewed as a potential for cropland in the past. And what happens is, particularly when we get into periods of very high crop prices, some of that marginal land will be put into crop production. And that really does a couple of negative things. It removes some of the land that would be used for animal grazing, which is a much longer term sort of application of that land. And it may put those lands into production that aren't appropriate. They may be close to water sources. They may be, again, closer to other populations where you just don't want to actually have agricultural production occurring. So I'd say at a minimum, the number that we talked about, 30 to 40% of the total land used for animal grazing around the world is unsuitable for any type of crop production. And it would be a fairly small amount of land that is used for animal grazing now that could be suitable for crop production that could be directly for human consumable crops.
Can I chime in on that as well? Because I think about the Sahel, where I work extensively, that land is not suitable, where most of the livestock are herded there. It's not suitable for crop production because it's short on rainfall. And so I think when I read the question, I think about that as, the Sahel of West Africa is livestock is the name of the game. It's very high portion of the GDP coming from agriculture is coming from livestock. And, Niger, Chad, Mali, Senegal, those places are producing livestock that gets shipped then into the southern coastal countries. And so I mean, that's just one example. It's quite different in the U.S. and developing countries. I guess that's one of the points that I wanted to raise, is that these large open grazing systems are largely at this point in lower and middle income countries, are they not?
No, I'm not sure that that's completely the case. For example, in the U.S., a lot of our western grazing lands are used as a part of our total, beef production system. In places like Argentina, you have significant grazing areas still, Australia and New Zealand. So other areas where you might have a combination of sort of very intensive finishing systems to go along with early life grazing and support of sort of that founder herd that's going to be producing those terminal animals.
All right, I'm going to skip the second part of this question and say that, we can also have questions emailed to us at livestock-lab@ufl.edu, and we'll definitely forward those to our speakers. There's another question for Dr. Dahl, and then Lad, you can jump in and ask some questions as well.
Great.
It says, hi, just a question for clarification. One of the last slides said livestock contributes 40% mean to GDP of developing countries. Was this 40% of total or 40% of GDP from agriculture?
I think that was from the total GDP in some of those developing countries, just based on the limited sort of outputs. Many of them are agrarian, and they're going to agriculture as their primary or one of their primary industries.
Great. Dr. McCune, there's a couple questions that did come in online around. One is around where does the scientific knowledge gap exist between ASF and human nutrition? I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at, but I assume that, why are some people maybe not consuming ASF, and where is that gap in the knowledge?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it's different. The question asked, thank you for that, is about the scientific knowledge gap, and that's quite different than in practice where the gap exists. So let me answer what I think is the question first. So there have been a number of meta-analyses conducted actually quite recently whose findings are positive but inconclusive about the role of animal source food and human nutrition. And having interviewed a number of people contributing to these studies and having looked at it fairly carefully, I do think that a major scientific gap has to do with rigorously designed studies. So we definitely need more rigorously, methodologically sound investigations to really understand the role of animal source food, not in a lab, but in a real setting, because we know that it's complex. We know that the interaction between the food and nutrients that a child gets and that child's gut health there are important system dynamics that we don't fully understand. But so I would say part of the knowledge gap is really having more studies to really understand the benefit of ASF food and how much ASF of a certain form, how much egg, how much beef from cattle, is that different than chicken, red meat, all of those nuances are things that we definitely still need to unpack in more detail.
Yeah, you're probably opening a can of worms when we get talking about, environmental enteropathy and some of the other things that are associated, often talked about with animals, with livestock and human nutrition. So I think that's interesting. There have been some studies around using, most of them around the food aid quality report, where they determined, and they looked at soy versus an animal source, being milk in this case, that they looked at where they did not see linear growth with soy, even though, that is kind of pushed out there as the highest plant-based protein that you can find and kind of the most complete. And they don't really know the reason, as you're saying right now. There maybe need to be more research of exactly what is it that creates that. It may or may not be just the protein. There may be something else,
Right.
Hormones or other things that come along with that we kind of need to be looking at. And so that's one of those things that's kind of still an unknown. Tyrell Kahan I probably pronounced that wrong, Tyrell, for Sarah to speak more about the SBCC intervention. I assume he's talking about the Burkina situation. What was done exactly? Why was that set of interventions chosen?
Yeah, so we designed that study based on two studies that came out in 2017. One was Laura Iannotti and her team's study from Ecuador that found remarkably significant shifts in stunting in kids that received an egg a day it was an RCT. It was a well-designed intervention, but importantly, the kids were given the eggs and through a social marketing campaign encouraged to eat them. At the same time, I met and became aware of a study by a young scientist, Anthony Omer, in Ethiopia, who had run, as part of his master's thesis, had designed a behavior change strategy that at its core was culturally embedded to catalyze behavior change through the gifting of chickens to children by imams, in that case, in a Muslim part of Ethiopia. And he had wildly successful results and was fairly convinced that this could be done other places, that it was the cultural significance of the child's flock, the benefit of of the child building his own, even at 6 months of age, young children. And so we designed a study that would combine those two things. And so the behavior change, the full behavior change intervention had to do with the gifting of chickens to the child, 3, that was matched by 1 from the family. So the child went into the study with a flock of 4 local chickens, and the mother having signed on, or the caregiver, to everything from that chicken belonging to the child. And then we did a monthly integrated nutrition and agriculture trainings with the caregiver. 99% of the caregivers were mothers. We had a few grandmothers that came in and out. But that was about, how do you feed a 6-month-old a hard-boiled egg? How do you mash it up and manually express breast milk and make it into a paste that a child will palate? So everything from those early days when the babies were younger, through poultry production. How do you clean up the landscape? How do you do what you can to reduce exposure to chicken feces, through them, and really, really focusing on that egg a day. We followed up with them monthly, so they ended up having monitoring 2 weeks after their trainings, and we used flip books, locally derived pictures, to give the messages to an illiterate population. The women kept the flip books. They really loved those. And ultimately, they made up songs and really had social cohesion in this group of women that I think ultimately led to the success of the behavior change intervention. So that's a long-winded answer, but it was a monthly intervention that ran for 10 months. Yeah, and the only difference is in the partial group, there was no asset given. So no gifting of chickens, no chickens at all.
Oh, okay, great. Andrew Beeson has a question. It says, thanks for the great presentations. Can the speakers say a bit more about the links between ASF productivity gains, prices of ASF, and consumer intake of ASF? So cost of a nutritious diet?
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions maybe in that one question. ASF is expensive. Animal source food is expensive. And I think, let me just go to my own research and think about it from that lens. There was a lot of skepticism that we would be able to catalyze behavior change around consumption of ASF, because these are very poor rural communities. And actually the idea for the grant stemmed from a conversation that I was witness to as part of my role in the lab, where there was an argument saying, we can't do anything about ASF consumption until we deal with poverty, that we really have to get incomes up. And half the room was saying, no, you actually, with education, you can move the bar. So I think we would be completely naive to think that we can reach all people and increase ASF from where they are today by simply education, messaging, behavior change. But you can do it some. I think that's the takeaway. But by and large, the IFPRI research has really driven this. ASF are expensive, and cost is a major barrier to increasing access to ASF. So one of the things that has recently been published is a cost analysis of the Eat Lancet report's recommended diet. And I think one of the things that comes from that is a real level of transparency that the Eat Lancet report recommendations for diet for planetary health, they're low in animal source food, but it's more than a lot of the population gets currently, and that the major barrier to that would be cost, that it costed between $2 to $3 a day.
1.6 to 1.8 billion people around the world can't afford that diet.
Right. So I think that's maybe a shorter answer to Andrew's question.
Yeah, and I think that goes directly just in general. I don't even think it matters in developing countries versus even developed countries. There's definitely a relationship between poverty and animal source availability and consumption and dietary appropriateness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that it's global.
Yeah. To be clear, the most significant portion of the Eat Lancet recommended planetary diet was fruits and vegetables. I think it was 30-something%, and then about 15-18% was ASF. So it's not simply the ASF that made it out of reach for most people, but I think it demonstrates the point.
Yeah, this is definitely something that I see worldwide, where people are having to choose between, I have 1 egg and I have 5 children, and can I sell my eggs and buy something that I can feed, a cheaper carb or even maybe a cheaper protein, depending on the situation, to be able
just more to fill their belly.
Right, to fill their bellies versus just the one quality egg for one child. We have another question. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name because I don't want to slaughter that so bad. But it says, thank you for the, oh, I just lost it. The screen moved up on me.
Yeah, I can see it. I think this is on the productivity of livestock in developing nations, that it's low. Correct. And it's going to contribute more proportionally to emissions. So what happens is there are fixed costs associated with just an animal living on the planet, and so those animals, a certain amount of the energy that they consume and the greenhouse gas outputs that they produce are just associated with their life. And so the higher productivity that we get in animals, the more efficient they are at converting additional energy, additional feeds into animal source foods, the better off we're going to be in terms of greenhouse gas emission per unit of human consumable food from those animals. So improving productivity and intensifying output from those animals can go a long way towards reducing that total greenhouse gas output per unit of animal product that they produce.
That's a good point. And I think it's interesting when you're talking about efficiency. I mean, things that you haven't really touched on because it wasn't really appropriate for this discussion potentially was around, you know, the use of animal feces for growing other agriculture products and kind of some of those things that can be used for. And I think the benefit of that. And I know, you know, when you talked about this efficiency of livestock and, you know, I assume that when we get to that kind of higher efficiency of livestock, we're going to see more like maybe what we see in the States, where instead of, you know, families of 12 that are working a dairy farm, you've reduced that because of the mechanization and other things that are available for dairy, as well as just being able to more efficiently do it with less, because of mechanization and other things, less people, which goes back to that family size, which goes back to the population of the earth and that continual need to supply those calories. So I think this could be a really important area to kind of you know, be able to really see gains in, to see benefit on both sides of the nutrition as well as the rest. And let's see, we've got another one.
I just want to jump in, Lad, and say, speaking of efficiency, we're doing really well. Our speakers were very efficient, and that left us lots of time for questions. But we have about 5 more minutes, so we might be able to get to all these questions. I just want to point out the one from Katie because she wrote it twice. She posted both on the chat and the Q&A session. So it's saying the slide that says removing ASF from our U.S. consumption only reduces greenhouse gases by 2.6%, shows a difference in GHG as 600 to 400 something, which is closer to a reduction of 30%. How is it that 2.6% was calculated?
So that's going to be, Katie, of the total greenhouse gases output from agriculture. So if we think about that being in that 6+% area, we're reducing that by 2 to 2.5 percentage units total, which, you know, so a third of that is going away if we were to reduce completely or eliminate completely the contributions from animal source outputs.
Excellent. Were any questions come in on Facebook that I'm not seeing, Jim? Otherwise, I think we've answered the questions that we have here, and maybe give both of the speakers one more chance to kind of sum up your thoughts today.
We have this one from Vincent on the Q&A session. He says, interesting study by White and Hall. However, rather than totally omit animal protein consumption, it would have been interesting to consider switching from high emitting to low emitting greenhouse gas emission species.
Yeah, Vincent, you're gonna hear my bias here because I'm more of a ruminant guy, and they are considered to be the ones that have the highest greenhouse gas output as opposed to some of our monogastrics. But there again is where we have to look at the complexity of the system that those animals are raised in. And so our grazing species that might be a little bit higher on their total greenhouse gas output per unit of output are also the ones that can convert those other products into human consumable food. They're the ones that can use that land that is inappropriate for crop production in order to produce output. So it's not quite as straightforward as shifting from high emitting to low emitting, for example, from ruminants to a monogastric sort of system, because they are more complex than that.
That's excellent. And maybe just final words from you guys, maybe what's next steps? What are you doing next? Or thoughts on this discussion in general?
Well, I think that, we've got a lot going on in the lab, some of which Sarah alluded to. Other areas that we're working on are really focused on making improvements in the local context in terms of emissions intensity. And so to get back to one of your comments, Lad, that we may be moving more towards a westernized system, a very high intensity system. I think there's a lot of room in between that we can make progress in terms of total productivity in some of the countries we're working on versus when we get to the levels of productivity that we see here in developed countries. So there's a lot in between that can be managed in a little bit different manner without significant changes to total inputs in order to realize improvements in output per animal.
Yeah, and I would just close by saying, my life is situated between public health and sustainable development. So I do a lot of work with climate change and resilience. And so the impact of livestock on climate is not lost on me. But I think we have to think about the populations that we're talking about and think about the globe, as a single unit. And how do we begin to meet both of these needs, the sort of preservation of systems on the planet and the real need for increasing animal source food consumption among the most vulnerable populations that really often consume none. And for me, that the takeaway there is really for those practitioners and implementers in development who work in livestock programs that there are, I believe, still very low-hanging fruit in terms of how we can begin to increase animal source food consumption. And I think for me, recognizing my own bias, that there's a lot of work to be done with behavior change, that some real strides can be made with focused, locally derived, culturally appropriate behavior change strategies. You get the right people on board and you get the messaging right, and we can move the needle. We don't need to up it to what the West consumes. That's the other problem, right? But we need to increase it so that particularly young kids, pregnant women have access to some animal source food during those critical periods of development.
That's great. I think that's important for, looking at implementers on both sides, looking at how can we intensify livestock and make that more efficient, as well as looking at both behavior change as well as other strategies to be, to ensure, especially that first 1,000 days, that those vulnerable people within that group have access to some level of animal source foods. And I think this will be an ongoing challenge. And it's a challenge, as Sarah talked about, in every single culture, every single people group within that culture, every single education, class, everything, it's a very complicated area to kind of think about unpacking. But I think you've both done a really good job today of kind of explaining this and looking at those tensions between, the environment and the consumption of animal source protein and the importance of that in our diets for growth. Any last thoughts, or Jim, anything else? I really encourage people to go to the Livestock website, the lab website. They have a lot of resources there. They kind of keep up to date on the most recent studies and things that are going on. And so there's a lot of really exciting things there. I would say the same for any of the labs. And so, if you find the lab, whether it's the sorghum lab or any of, the nutrition lab, any of those behavior change labs, all of those, they always have really good information and key contact people that you can reach out to if you have questions about what's going on in, in current research in these areas. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you have further questions, as Jim said, they will be happy to deal with those and send answers back written, I suppose. If that's how that's going to happen, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much, Lad, for your participation. Yeah, for pointing out our website. There's also our email and our social media. We hope that you'll connect with us as well. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but many of them. I hope we can continue this conversation offline. And so I just want to say thank you to our panelists, our speakers, and to Lad for moderating, and for everyone who tuned in to join this live webinar. This has been brought to you by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems, and we appreciate your time. And like I said, let's continue this conversation.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.